Hi, thanks for listening to my talk. My name's Daniel Hickey. I'm a professor with the Learning Sciences program in the Department of Instructional Systems Technology at Indiana University. This is my presentation for the Research and Theory Division's 2022 Theory Spotlight Competition. It's entitled Designing for Productive Disciplinary Engagement and Responsive Assessment with Situated Cognition and Expansive Framing. My work is consistent with all four of RTD's goals, but it's particularly consistent with the second goal concerning multiple perspectives. My work is resolutely grounded in situative theories of cognition. I'm going to show you that situated cognition is much more than cognitive apprenticeship or anchored instruction or other pedagogies. Rather, when you assume that knowledge is fundamentally grounded in the social and cultural context in which it was learned, it reveals new solutions to enduring problems in education. This is also consistent with AECT's pivot in 2020, where they moved away from technology and towards difficult problems and how they can be addressed through innovative designs and appropriate technology, as signaled by the reorganization of the handbook. What are these difficult problems? Well, I'll show you that I address some relatively general problems, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. That's been going on for quite some time. Formative and summative assessment, teaching to the test, historical discrimination. Many of the problems I'll talk about today, reflecting the second half of my career, really specific to online education, instructor burnout, student engagement and isolation, peer interaction, and the validity of assessments. These are some of the emerging scholars I've had the pleasure of working with in my career, as well as some of the more established researchers. I've had the pleasure of working with really some of the top innovators in educational technology. These collaborations were made possible with the generous support of a number of internal and external sponsors. Starting with my work as a postdoctoral fellow at the ETS Center for Performance Assessment, I spent the first decade of my career focusing on what I call multi-level assessment. This approach is more responsive than traditional assessment that's concerned with formative and summative assessment. Rather, learning is aligned across three or more increasingly formal levels of assessment. A broader situative view of learning makes it possible for the same assessment to serve a summative function for one kind of learning and a formative function for another kind of learning. This is a way of ensuring achievement without teaching to the test. My work is fundamentally influenced by the ideas of the late Randy Engel. Productive disciplinary engagement was introduced in 2002 as a situative alternative to cognitive theories of engagement that emphasize engagement is disciplinary when it involves the discourse of the discipline. That engagement is productive when it gets somewhere, opens new questions, answers questions, and it's pretty widely used. But they also generated in 2002 a set of design principles that are among the most useful and used principles for designing instruction. First and foremost is that you want to help students problematize content from their own perspectives. This is different than what you see in anchored instruction, most versions of problem-based learning, where experts design context and problems for students. When students problematize from their own perspective, you can then give them the authority to solve the problems that result, and you can hold students accountable to their participation in disciplinary discourse. Finally, though, you need to provide students the necessary resources that they need to carry out those first three principles. Along the way, I continued to pursue my interest in motivation and revisited some of the ideas that I explored in my graduate work using situated cognition. In particular, I became quite intrigued about using the situative synthesis from Jim Greeno as a way to sidestep the tensions between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. This gets complicated pretty quickly, well beyond the scope of the presentation, but the bottom line is that you want to focus primarily on productive disciplinary engagement and only secondarily on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation by treating them as special cases of social activity. Combining those previous ideas ultimately resulted in a framework that I called participatory learning and assessment. Again, this was just embedding the PDE design principles within the multiple levels of assessment and then overlaying situated motivation across it. And those five design principles really we worked with for quite a few years The first one, use public context to give meaning to knowledge tools. That essentially is a cover for Engel's design principles for PDE. And then the remaining four principles are really uh, concern the multi-level assessment. And that work was carried out in the context of thinking about transfer, in principles for classroom management, principles for vocational education, new models for educational video games, and new ways of thinking about new media. I spent much of the second half of my career extending PLA using Engel's notions of expansive framing. This suggests that if you want learning that's going to transfer, learners need to make connections, numerous connections with outside people, places, topics, and times. They need to talk about how they're going to use what they're learning in the future. If you do this, you can position learners as accountable authors who are participating in an extended conversation. So for example, in my assessment and learning course, where much of my refinement has initially been carried out, students first describe a personally relevant curricular aim and learning context. Then they can learn about assessment practices, for instance, creating different item types by applying the guidelines from the textbook to create examples that they share with their classmates. And then they're asked to summarize those guidelines in order of personal relevance. So something that they didn't know that changed what they did is particularly relevant and should come first, whereas something that they already knew isn't very relevant to them personally. They do the same learning about assessment principles. For example, validity, the four different types of validity evidence. These are really complicated things, and a lot of students struggle to distinguish between validity and reliability. Well, if you have them, for example, identify which types of validity evidence are most relevant to the item types that they created in the first part of the course, that really grounds these complex concepts in their own experience, in their experience in which they're the experts. Similarly, they learn about assessment policy, identifying which of these aspects of this policy are most relevant to your context. In addition to work in my graduate courses, we've used these ideas in technical training, a big open online course at IU, and in undergraduate ed psych courses. PLA has been central to a long-running research practice partnership with the fully online Indiana University High School. Rebecca Ito completed her dissertation adapting PLA, working with a subset of teachers at IUHS, and was subsequently appointed principal with a mandate of expanding this partnership. We're doing so with a $2 million grant from the Governor's Emergency Educational Relief Fund to the Office of School Partnerships to create 50 new courses, and a recent $3 million grant to the office from the Well-Rounded Courses Demonstration Project from the Department of Education. Starting in 2020, we began making PLA more broadly accessible for diverse communities, starting with this article in a special issue of ETR&D on theory and instructional design. Here you see we took the 5 theory-laden design principles and transformed them into 14 discrete steps. This is intended to be ready to use by instructional designers who are likely grounded in cognitive theories but may not be grounded in situative theories. This article was written with our high school educators for high school educators. We just laid out these 11 very straightforward steps to creating a G portfolio assignment in this case. We paid particular attention to communicating to the community concerned with online assessment, in this case, an article in a special issue of Distance Education on reimagining assessment. Other works concerning online assessment are 2 literature reviews, one in the International Handbook of Open Online and Distance Education in a section edited by Rick West, and another one that's currently in revision for the Review of Educational Research. Right now, I'm most excited about our extension of PLA into what we're calling culturally sustaining educational assessment. We used Agarwal and Sengupta Irving's extension of the PDE into connective and productive disciplinary engagement to extend each of the 5 design principles to make them more culturally sustaining. Finally, a few related efforts as a recent tribute in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Education to Engel's work, an invited commentary in a special issue of Educational Psychologist, and a number of systematic reviews of PDE and expansive framing. Thank you very much for your time and your consideration. I'm happy to answer any questions at my email address there. Many of the papers that I've referenced here can be downloaded from our blog, Remediating Assessment. Thanks again. Bye now.